Joining me now is the best-selling author of The Madness of Crowds, The Strange Death of Europe, and his latest work, The War on the West, Douglas Murray. Douglas, let's start with the hate and hyperbole directed towards a movie that is based on a real story of a real man, Tim Ballard, a former Department of Homeland Security agent who became an anti-human trafficking activist, saving children. But according to the leftist media, and we're talking here from the New York Times to Rolling Stone, the movie, The Sound of Freedom, is some sort of QAnon adjacent conspiracy. And right here in Australia, Nine Media have slavishly followed this dumb, dishonest narrative with this headline: the QAnon adjacent film that's become a massive box office hit. And The Guardian is even more triggered after Trump hosted a screening of The Sound of Freedom. I would have thought, Douglas, we could all be against human trafficking. Why is there so much hate and dishonesty about this movie?
Yeah, it's one of those things when something just gets caught up in the culture wars that makes absolutely no sense. The film in question, as you say, is not only about a subject which people care about deeply and quite rightly, but don't care about enough, in my view. And so a film like this should be praised for actually bringing attention to such a subject. But it seems that it's what we used to call popular. The Oscars, for instance, routinely now and shortlist for Best Picture films that people haven't even gone to the cinema to see. Films that basically were made by some cinema makers for other cinema makers to watch. And then sometimes something comes out like this, and it hits a really popular nerve. But it seems to be that the critics and others are fearful of popular movies. The same thing happened with Top Gun Maverick last year. And I don't really understand it myself, other than this sort of grotesque distaste that some of the critics have for the general public. I think that the distaste is probably at this point reciprocated, of course.
Absolutely. And this film, I think it's already got about $100 million, and it was made on a shoestring budget. So we might see a few more productions like this. Absolutely. We're on the left's fatwa against art. I don't know if you're into country music, but there's a new banger that's sitting at the #1 position in the charts that has again triggered all the usual suspects. It's a song that's about anti-violence. It's against the sort of rioting and anti-police sentiment that we saw in the US in the last few years. Let's have a listen.
You think it's cool, act a fool if you like. Cuss out a cop, spit in his face, stomp on the flag and light it up. Yeah, you think you're tough. Well, try that in a small town. See how far you make it down the road. Around here we take care of our own.
Douglas, the media seems to have decided that if you hate riots, and then you're some sort of a racist and you're pro-lynching. I've got to say, I love the track. Try that in a small town, and it makes me want to move to McKinney, Texas, like tomorrow. But where is the racism? I am familiar with the lyrics. I know them back to front now. Where is the racism that I'm not seeing?
The racism was all accused. All those accusations were made this week because the video of the song was released. And the video, as you just said, Rita, shows footage of people doing terrible things a few years ago. Is everyone meant to be in favor of those things, like that flag burning and violence and things? And the main accusation, as far as I can see, about this song is that still you just saw in the video. That bit is a scene in front of a rather spectacular building in, I think, Tennessee. And somebody found out that about 100 years ago, just under 100 years ago, there'd been a lynching outside that courthouse, a state house.
Oh,
now,
geez.
They said on the basis of that the song is pro-lynching. But, I mean, one of my tests in this era, Rita, is are we able to listen to other people talking and listen in a spirit of generosity or in a spirit of incredible hostility, looking for the worst possible interpretation to put on something? And this whole episode has been an example of the second of those things. You might just say, well, look, lots of films and videos turn out to be made, outside beautiful buildings. A lot of old buildings have a lot of negative history. The question then is, should be, did you aim to use this building because of that particular aspect of the bad history, or is it just, that you used a good backdrop? Now, any reasonable person would ask that sort of question, but of course we live in a very unreasonable age, and so people put the worst possible spin on things. I think these are people who think that effectively all of America is a crime scene and that everyone in it is basically criminal. I think it's a really lamentable way to look at things, and a very sad indictment, as you say, on our era, and not on the people who are trying to make some sense of it.
Oh, and given the number of songs that are released almost daily that have got violent themes, misogyny, racism, all sorts of gangbanger material, to be objecting to the lyrics of this song, and I encourage everybody to have a look at the actual lyrics and see if you can detect any racism at all. In fact, I think it's racist to look at a song that's about anti-rioting and interpret that as anti-black. I mean, that's
absolutely.
You're showing what you're thinking of. That's a tell. Now, let's go to some massive news concerning the US president. I've got to say, none of this is good. The front page of today's New York Post says it all. More details about the Bidens being protected by the swamp. This time, the IRS, we've got a second whistleblower from that organisation coming forward saying his bosses thwarted his investigation into Hunter and Joe Biden. And this comes as a bombshell FBI informant file is released, which describes a $10 million bribery allegation against President Biden and his son Hunter, with a Ukrainian oligarch claiming that he was coerced into making the payoff. Douglas, these are astonishing developments.
They are. And you and I have spoken before, Rita, about this incredibly dangerous thing in American life, which is the way in which institutions are becoming sort of owned by one side of the aisle and then another, and they're loved by one side of the aisle and then the other. At the moment, the Democrats are once again furious about whistleblowers. Maybe next week, the Republicans will be furious about whistleblowers. Everyone shifts depending on the target of the investigation. Now, the IRS is a really interesting case of this, because in recent years, the IRS has been found to be actively pursuing people who it finds, are sort of politically unpalatable to certain people, shall we say. Look at the journalist Matt Taibbi. He testified earlier this year in front of Congress, and he said some unpopular things that some of the people in Congress didn't like. He had the IRS onto him within the week. So we already knew that before this week that it can be used as a political weapon. But this testimony this week, Rita, effectively showed how it can also turn its eye away from certain subjects. And this is the testimony of particularly the man who until Thursday of this week was known as Mr. X. We didn't know his name and identity. He turns out to be a Democrat, this whistleblower. He turns out to be a lifelong Democrat. He's also gay, and he's married to a gay man. And he's not your obvious sort of, far-right Republican, Trumpy, I don't know, January the 6th. He's somebody within the IRS who was concerned that an investigation was being shut down for political purposes. And I just think this speaks once again to this thing that we've talked about, the danger of what happens when all of your institutions become politicized. It's disastrous for democracy.
Absolutely. In the US, we've got the Justice Department, the FBI, the IRS. It is, the swamp is deep. Now, I wanted to ask you about a fantastic piece you wrote, a brave piece about Canada's euthanasia laws. These assisted dying laws are supposed to be all about compassion. Tell me why you say it's a horror story in Canada.
Well, I've written before quite a lot about this subject. It's a horrible subject, euthanasia, because end-of-life care is always an incredibly sensitive issue, and people have incredibly strong views in every direction. There's an issue of bodily autonomy and much more. But in recent years, I've interviewed doctors in, for instance, Belgium and the Netherlands who have performed euthanasia and continue to do so. And I noticed when I first started speaking to them that there was one thing in particular, because Britain was looking at euthanasia at this time. They often remarked to me that Britain had better palliative care than their countries because we didn't have euthanasia. Now, that struck me as a very interesting and important point. And that was with the allowance only of euthanasia for people with inoperable terminal conditions at the very end of their lives. But what I noticed also was that in country after country where this was done, it moved. People said, oh, you're getting all slippery slope on us, Douglas. But there have been cases I have written about and tried to highlight in recent years which really do prove that on this, the slope is very slippery indeed. I wrote last year about this poor young woman who was involved in the Belgian airport attack, the Brussels airport attack in 2016, saw a number of her classmates at the age of 17 blown to smithereens. And she was euthanized last year by the Belgian state because she had PTSD and depression from that attack. Now, Belgium won't of course, execute the perpetrators of the attack, the cell that survived, but they did end up putting her down on the state. And something very similar is happening in Canada. And in short, what it is in 2016, the Trudeau government, with all the liberal, hippy-dippy, lovey stuff that they always do around everything, said this is just end-of-life care. And then they brought it forward. And now we have the fact that in March of next year, that what they call MAID Act, which is the Assisted Dying Act in Canada, will, as of March next year, be allowed to take in patients who are not terminally ill and are not physically ill, but have a mental illness. And there have already been, and I write about this in the piece, I urge people to read it because it's a very, very serious issue, this. A 47-year-old woman who suffered from anorexia all of her life is going to be able to be euthanized next March in Canada. Now, what does that say to all of the young women and their families struggling with anorexia? And what does it say about the soldiers returning from war with PTSD in Canada, one of whom has already been suggested to have euthanasia to deal with his PTSD? When people say this is all slippery slope argument, Douglas, very, very cheap argument, I say, no, the slope is really slippery. And in societies where we're always told, rightly or wrongly, that mental health is equivalent to physical health and mental illness equivalent to physical illness, just watch as this becomes a road to hell.
Oh, I don't think it's even a slippery slope. It's a bloody water slide. We're talking here about state-sanctioned suicide for mental health issues. We look at suicide as a tragedy because that's what it is, and now we're facilitating it. The state's facilitating it. It really is just and in the Benelux countries, as you explained, that's already a reality. Yeah. Now, finally, I want to ask for your assistance here. I want you to help us educate Lydia. That's Senator Lydia Thorpe, who said this about King Charles.
Do you recognise King Charles as sovereign?
Not at all. I recognise him as an invader, a violent invader. Yes, he wasn't personally responsible, but he certainly relishes in the wealth that has been created on the backs of slavery, on the backs of massacres and murders and stolen children.
Whoa.
Douglas, if you could, in a simple and yet succinct manner, just help Lydia out there.
I'm not sure that Lydia's thought this one through. First of all, I mean, one of the basics of our society is that the sins of the father are not brought upon the son. In any case, not even King Charles's father went around stealing children. I don't think you'd have to go back many, many centuries to find anyone associated with a king who went around stealing children or invading lands. I mean, the late Queen didn't go around invading lands and stealing children, as far as I remember. The wealth that the monarchy has accrued over the years is a very, very long way away from the slave trade now. But if the senator is going to do this, I think we should make it reciprocal, don't you, Rita? We should find out what her ancestors were up to. I bet that they weren't all pacifists. I bet that they didn't all spend their days preaching peace and harmony. And if that is the case, Rita, then we should hold it against her, and we should make sure that she too has to pay for the sins of her forebears.